How's it, data firm? Welcome to the fifth episode of our Excel Fundamentals for Data Analysts. Now, today we're going to look at a topic that I think a lot of people generally try to avoid, which is pivot tables. Look, pivot tables are really easy to learn and they're not really that complex. The selling point or the value of using pivot tables is when your data is, because normally your data that you work with in Excel is very detailed. Pivot tables allow you to actually summarize your data and get insights that you might have not been able to get at the detailed view of your data. So think of pivot tables as creating a summarized table of your detailed data set. So today we're going to explore how exactly you can build pivot tables and the different features that pivot tables actually come with. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. Great. So the first thing that you want to do is just to make sure that you've imported the student data set. So I've already added the data set onto the description on this video. So you can just go over there and download it from Kaggle. So it's a student data set. It basically has the performance of students in different subjects based on parental level of education and all of that, right? Cool. So before we get into the detail, just want to run through what exactly is the data that you're working through. So you can see that we've got the first column, which is gender. So this is basically whether it's a male or female. Then B is the race or ethnicity. So they've actually given us group A, B, C, D up until E as the different sort of like ethnicity groups that we have been given. Then we've got parental level of education, right? So this is basically or how far or what is the level of education for the parents of these students. And then the lunch of standard. So lunch is basically about whether they're getting a standard lunch or the lunch is free or it's a reduced lunch. So maybe that could have an impact on the marks. So I think that's what this data set was meant to study. Then the other one is test preparation course, or whether a preparation course is actually done before the test or not. So that's also might impact the marks. Then we've got the different subjects. So we've got three subjects: maths, reading, and writing. So those are the different sort of like scores that we actual subjects that we actually have. So now you're probably wondering, how can we build a pivot table this, and why should you even build a pivot table, right? If I were to ask you how many males do we have and how many females do we actually have, right? Through this data set, you cannot tell that because it's too detailed and you might have to manually do some counts and whatever that's going to take time, right? Or if I say how many females are in the ethnicity group B and how many have parents that have a bachelor's degree and how many of them get a standard lunch, that's so much information. And because you've got a detailed view of the data set, it's really hard for you to make sense of the data set. Now, what the pivot tables do, they summarize data for you. It's still a table, but it's a summarized table. Think of it as a way to summarize the data that you already have in order for you to gain insights or even report to your managers and all of that, right? So that is what the selling point for pivot tables is for. So now we're going to create a very simple pivot table. I'm going to take you through everything that you need to understand. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into, I think it should be insert. So once you go into insert, you can see that you've got pivot table. So you want to click on that one. Once you click on that one, you can see that it highlights the entire table that you actually have. And then I'm going to say new worksheet because new worksheet goes into a new worksheet, but existing actually does the analysis on an existing worksheet, which I don't think is something that you should actually do. So try to avoid that. So I'm going to say new worksheet. So new worksheet, what happens is at the moment you click on this, you can see that your view sort of does change. So you've got pivot table analysis. So this is where you're mostly going to be working in most cases, right? And then you've got design. So design is more around the coloring and all of that. So you might not even use this quite a lot, right? So over here, you can see that you've got this thing that says pivot table one. So this is where your pivot table data or results are going to be populated. And then if you look at on your right, you've got all the different columns that you are actually that are from your table that you imported into this pivot table. Now, at the bottom, this is where the magic actually happens. So this is where you see all the things that you need to actually do your building and all of that, right? So filter, very basically, this is actually a filters option. It allows you to add filters onto your pivot table. Columns. So what columns does, if you guys think about it, columns are normally arranged in a sense of starting from your left all the way to your right. So columns would be structured like this, right? And then rows would be anything that goes vertically down, right? So rows, anything that vertically down. And then values. So values, this is anything that you want to summarize, numbers, count, minimum, averages, right? But I'm going to show you how exactly all this real estate actually works. So to demonstrate the difference between the rows box and the column box, I'm just going to take the gender, right? If I take the gender and put it under rows, you can see that we've got the gender male and female. So it will be arranged in a particular row. But if we take this and put it under column, it actually changes, right? It's now creating columns for each and every single field, right? So it really depends on how you want to analyze your data. So I'm going to take this back over here and I'm going to take, let's say, ethnicity, and I'm going to put the ethnicity under columns. Now, if you take the ethnicity and put it under columns, what you're doing is that you have got these particular rows, right? These are the rows we've got. And now you're creating columns for each and every single ethnicity. This is great, right? This is something that you want to do, especially if you want to do analysis of your data. So you now understand that columns create columns based on the data that is sitting within that particular column over here, right? So it takes all the data in this row, right, and then creates columns using that data. That is exactly what the column view actually does. Now, this is useful in a sense that you can actually either do this or put this under. Now, if you were to put the ethnicity under the gender, what happens is that now you can actually see that all the A, B, C actually go below, and you can see all the different ethnicities, right? Then another thing you can do, if you take the gender, right? I want you to watch this. If you take the gender and you put it below the ethnicity, do you see that this whole thing then shifts? Now you can see that in all the ethnicities, what are the different genders, right? So the hierarchy over here really does matter. If this one is at the top, going to try to bring it at the top, then the whole thing actually changes. So it's very important for you to understand what you're analyzing. If you're looking at a product and the product categories, maybe this could actually be useful to you, right? Now, what I want to bring now is I want to bring, let's say, what can we actually bring? I want to bring something that we can actually summarize, right? I'm going to bring the math score and put it under values, right? So what this is doing, it's basically doing a sum of the math score. So you can see that the total sum of the math score is actually 66,000, right? And it seems like the numbers are slightly evenly distributed between the genders, right? So you can actually see that for males, this is the total mark that they're contributing. So meaning males actually contribute more than females based on this particular data set. And already you can actually see which ethnicities were contributed the lowest. So you can see group, I think in this case, it would be group A that's contributing the lowest. And then you can see that over here, it is also group A. So already you're getting a summarization of information. Now tell me, how are you going to know this information over here? It's completely impossible for you to get this type of insights on a detailed data set, right? So the pivot table really allows you to summarize your data and brings all the insights that you might have not been able to see over here, right? So now that you guys are convinced, or maybe you can see the value of using pivot tables. Now, if I asked you then, maybe let's try to get more information, right? What is the minimum score, right, for each of the groups? This would allow us to understand maybe there's some groups that are actually struggling or whatever. Or on average, the marks are low for each of the groups, right? If I go to this data set, remember values, right? So values is very important. If you go to values, this is where you put all your summarization. So this is currently saying sum. But what you can do, if you look at the corner over here, you can click on this drop down, right? And you go field settings, right? So currently we are doing the sum, but let's say I want to see the average, right? Maybe let's start with the average. What is the average mark for each of these different groups? I'm going to say this. I'm going to say, okay, now we're getting the averages, right? So I know this looks a little bit messy, but it's not a problem. So you can just click on B and you can just come over here on the general. So this is actually I'm going to decrease. Okay, for some reason it is not working. Let me try doing this. Let me select just one. Okay, I think I know why it wasn't working. So I just need to make sure that I select this. And there we go. Cool. So now we can see the numbers much more clearly. So you just need to just decrease the decimal places. I feel like they were just making a lot of noise. So if you can see now, you can say, okay, cool. On average, the average mark is actually very low at this group, which makes sense because we already saw the sum. But in this case, we can still see it's the same. Okay, cool. I think the average is good. Now tell me, how are you going to know the average on that previous table, right? Stay with me. Now, what I'm going to do now next is I'm going to go to values again, and I'm going to look for the minimum. So you click on the minimum, and now you can see the lowest score actually came from Group C. So from Group C, actually, someone scored a 0. As much as we saw that actually the group with the lowest mark was B, but the lowest mark, the overall sum of the contribution is low at B. But actually, funny enough, B is the highest minimum score. I don't know, it's very interesting. So you can see that Group C actually is the lowest, but from the male perspective, it seems like Group A, well, it's Group C. Okay, something is clearly happening at Group C because majority of them have the lowest marks. So there's definitely something worth investigating. Now you can further change this to the maximum, right? Let's see. Now the maximum. So actually someone has got 100% on Group E, and also someone's got 100% on Group D. It's very interesting, D and E. So you can see that D and E really, they've got really high performance. I think it seems like our top lenders are actually sitting in those ethnicities, right? So it's quite interesting stats. So this is really the value of actually being able to use this area and actually change all those different numbers. Now, another thing that I think is important to note is that if you don't like this view, you can actually take the race, you put it under columns, then you rearrange the way your data is actually structured. So you can now look at your data in this view. So this is really the selling point of using these pivot tables, right? But one more thing that I want us to try out, right? So remember, we haven't used the filter, right? This is the one thing that we have not learned how to do. So the filter over here, this is where you can add whatever you want to filter by. If I say I want to check if maybe whether someone has gotten lunch or what is an impact, I'm going to take lunch and I'm going to add it as a filter, right? Because now lunch is added as a filter. If I click on this drop down, I can say free lunch. Then you see the marks are slightly changing. So now we are only looking at the analysis of the gender and the different groups based on people that had lunch or not lunch. Now, this is people that did not have lunch. You can see the numbers around 81, 88, 87. Okay, it's not bad numbers. If I change to standard, the numbers go up. So this immediately tells us that there's actually something to do with whether someone gets lunch or does not get lunch, right? So immediately, like imagine the amount of insights that we're already getting from just using these pivot tables. We haven't even visualized anything. We are just simply getting a summary of our data set. And that's really is the selling point of actually using these pivot tables and all of that. But another cool thing that we can do, we can also remove this filter. I'm going to take this filter out, right? I'm just gonna select all. So just make sure that you select all. Now, instead of filtering, I'm gonna take this lunch and I'm gonna edit under gender. Now, because I've added it under gender, what it's now going to do, it will create the female gender, and then you've got free and standard, right? So now already we've got a side-by-side comparison of the marks for females that had standard lunch and reduced lunch. So overall, we can see that standard lunch actually does have an impact because there is no instance where free lunch actually beats standard lunch. If we go to males, similar statistics can also be seen, right? That majority of the males that are getting really good marks actually did have lunch, right? So this is really the nice thing about using this. Now, because now we are currently separating this based on the female, you can actually remove the gender. So if I remove the gender, you can now see the data analysis is now based on free lunch or not free lunch. So because over here we only have the lunch and all of that. So that's really is the selling point of using pivot tables. There's so many questions that you can actually answer using pivot tables, right? The most important thing to understand is that the rows allows you to add as much as you can. So you can add the gender, you can add the level of parental education. So you see, you can bring as much. So whenever you add something to a row, it creates a subcategory over and over and over. Now, because we added lunch, we added gender, we added parental level of education, and then now we can clearly see that, okay, cool. For free reduced lunch, these are the stats and all of that. So you go all the way to the bottom and you can see what is actually happening. But now, what I'm curious about, maybe that's one final stats we can actually investigate, is to say how many, what is the relationship between the, let's say, the level of education for the parents and the marks of the students, right? So maybe let's just untick everything. Just gonna remove everything, right? So what I want to investigate now is their relationship between the marks of the students and the level of education of their parents. So because the parents' level of education is what we want to measure, right? Whatever that you want to measure, you need to put as the rows. So I'm going to take the parental level of education, right? So we've got all the list of parental level of education. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take math score. So you see the med score, because these are the numbers that we want to analyze. So always put them on values. And I'm going to put the reading score and the writing score, right? This works because this is literally creating these different columns, right, over here. So we are taking this value, we have it here, we're taking the other value, then we're adding them over here, right? Cool. So now what I'm curious about is that to say, okay, cool. Based on this information, we can already see that the highest sort of mark on maths seems to be coming from some college education, right? So this parent has some sort of college education, yet the maths marks are actually higher. And if we look at this data set over here, we can also see that the highest one is actually here, so associate degree. And if we look at this data set, we can also see, okay, some college. So what I can deduct from here is that a parent's level of education doesn't really have an impact on the overall performance of the students, because it seems like it doesn't really link to whether you've got a master's degree. That's actually parents with master's degree have a relatively low, their students tend to, their children actually tend to have a very low mark than the other well, students and all of that. So maybe it has something to do whether the parents are always busy and all of that. But really, the idea is to understand that this is what you can do if you are using pivot tables, right? And if you wanted to get the average, you know how to change the average. And if you wanted to bring any additional layer, you could add it under the rows, and you've got all that additional layering. Or if you wanted to filter by the gender, you just do that and you apply gender. So in a nutshell, that is how you use pivot tables, right? They're not really anything complicated. I think it's really understanding what the filter does, what the columns actually does and what the rows actually does, right? And just as a reminder, columns allows you to create multiple columns and all of that, right? So in a nutshell, that is how you would basically use pivot tables. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about the much more advanced pivot tables, which is Power Pivot. But this was a brief introduction into what exactly pivot tables are and what you can actually do using pivot tables. So it's something that's really good for summarizing your data set and allows you to get insights that you might not be able to get just using your standard table as it actually is. So if you guys like this video, please make sure that you subscribe and like this video so that more people can actually see this video.